Ambassador Verveer, thank you so much for joining us on Foreign Press USA. It's great to have you. You know, you've had such an accomplished career, but as your current title, you are the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And you also served as the first U.S. ambassador for Global Women's Institute. And that was a position that was nominated to you by former President Obama back in 2009. During that time, you coordinated foreign policy issues, activities regarding political, economic, and social advancement for women, and you traveled to nearly 60 countries. Can you talk a little bit about your work during that time, and if you witnessed common threads about the challenges and opportunities that you saw in working with these women around the world, and perhaps what stood out most for you?
Well, first of all, let me just say it is a pleasure to be with you and to be able to engage in this conversation. The progress for women is an ongoing journey. Many countries are farther ahead in terms of the progress they've made. Others are farther behind. And I think as a general statement, progress has been uneven. And there's some areas where we have had greater success and others which are still lagging considerably. So if you look at any measure, let's take the Beijing Platform for Action that was adopted over 25 years ago. We had the celebration during the peak of COVID, or I should say, commemoration. And what one sees as that platform had to do with access to education, to health care, to participation meaningfully in the political life of one's country, economic life, to be free from violence, to have legal protections. There have been many supports over the years in enabling that to take place. Look at girls' education, for example, dramatic increases. But that said, COVID has taken a toll, and we don't know how many millions are not going to go back, having been pushed out of school because of the lockdown and the needs that their families had during that terrible contagion as it went on. Violence against women is still a huge problem, but since then, just about every country, a great majority of countries, have put laws in place to really address it in terms of prevention and support, but also in terms of really trying to address the need to prosecute the perpetrators. Are we there? No, because a lot of the laws haven't been fully implemented, but it was moving in the right direction. So as a general proposition, there has been significant progress, but we know that obstacles still exist, and I would say that among the many obstacles are norms, deeply entrenched practices that hold it back, attitudes, biases that need to be addressed. We need to have more of the good men involved in this because they are still largely in positions of leadership and can make an enormous difference, and many have. But this needs to be a greater partnership for progress, because in the end, progress for women is about women, but it's also progress for society. When women succeed, all of society succeeds. And no country is going to get ahead if it leaves half of its population behind. So we can't see this as a zero-sum game. We really need to see it for what it represents, for the benefit of half the population of the world and for the benefit of all society.
Yeah, you also held a position of U.S. representative to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And, as you speak, there's so much passion in the way you speak, and so much of your work throughout the years has been dedicated to the empowerment, to the progress of women and girls. What motivates you to continue going? How did you decide to get into this work? And why is it so important for you personally?
Well, interestingly, I didn't plan to be engaged in this field. I was involved many years ago in civil rights work and human rights work, but it really wasn't until I was in the Clinton administration, really at the right hand of then First Lady Hillary Clinton. And it was also during that time that the Beijing Fourth World Conference on Women, the UN conference, took place. And that was just an extraordinary moment, both for me personally, for her, I would say, but also for the tens of thousands of people that have been involved in this field and really got a additional support or a catalyst, if you will, for that work to go on and to really become an even more robust movement. And maybe I can hearken back to when the First Lady got up in Beijing to give her speech. The line that's remembered, that historic line, is that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. Not that women are a separate category in human rights, but women are human and they should be fully endowed with the protection of those rights as any human being. And what that was all about, in many ways, was to ensure that there would be the equality that we all want to see. And so when she got up and talked about some of the abuses that women still suffer the world over, whether it's dowry burnings or honor killings or human trafficking or violence in one's own home or taking away the life of a girl just because she's born a girl, that sort of uh, marginal view of her as a full person. After each one of these abuses, she said, and that is a violation of human rights. And from this day forward, we must continue to work towards ensuring that every girl and woman has the full protection of her rights. And after that, and in the course of it, one could see the reaction from the audience. There were people in the thousands from all over the world. And when she would hit certain issues that were more prevalent in some countries, you could see the reaction that it elicited. And that reaction, in many ways, I think was interpreted as this powerful person, because she was as the wife of the President of the United States at the time, lifting up the issues, very issues we have been working on. And many people have been working on these for a long time, working in the trenches, working against great odds, sometimes risking their lives on the front line.
Yeah.
And that was this sense of we're all in this together, no matter if I'm working on one issue or another, but it is about this collective uplift. And that inspired so much work on the part of the First Lady. She went on to carry these issues in significant programmatic and policy ways around the world. And there was something about that ingredient of knowing that in doing this, it's about all of us. It's about the fact that we may be different, we may speak different languages, we may have different histories, but in fact, we are more similar than we are different. And this is about all of us. And that sense of unity, that sense of movement, that sense of really trying to make a difference on these issues in ways that would have impact was a very strong motivator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You and I, we sit here and we talk about it and we understand it so well. And there are so many women and girls around the world that draw inspiration about how the United States is spearheading this movement. And really not just in women's rights, but in human rights in general. Really, it's one of our ethos to export that as much as possible. But then you come across problems like tradition, like perhaps in some cases religion, and issues like that. And since you've been in the field and you've traveled and you've worked with so many different individuals in different cultures, how do you push back against that, and how do you try to work around that when when you have certain traditions and aspects that you've been dealing with for generation after generation? It's very hard to really talk to someone like that or debate with someone like that. So what are some of the ingredients?
Well, first of all, an awful lot of times the pushback comes from those who say these are Western ideas and they're being somehow pushed on other people. And that's the farthest thing from the truth. Whenever I meet with women anywhere in the world, I always ask them what are they most concerned about, what kinds of changes are they eager to see, what are they up against, etc. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. Last week, the Taliban announced that no Afghan girl from sixth grade up should be able to go to school. Well, that is a critical violation of core human rights. Now, they've made various excuses for taking this position, and one of them is that somehow it is inconsistent with Islam. Well, the truth of the matter is, name the predominantly Muslim country, girls are in school. Islam, experts in Islam will tell you it is a core principle of the religion to really ensure the education of all. And so, what they have done is hijack the faith tradition and use it for their own political purposes, whatever they are, and say that they're prevailing against the future and aspirations of girls in Afghanistan, based on their radical view, which serves their own political purpose. But let me take it down to the community level.
Yeah.
And I remember working with a group in Senegal, in Africa, and like many places, they were practicing what's called FGM, female genital cutting. And there was a group we came in touch with that were working on principles of democracy with villagers. And the women in the village said, "What do we do with this thing called democracy?" And the response was, "Well, do you want to see changes in your life? Is there something in your life you'd like to work toward solving, a problem perhaps?" And they said that they went through this horrific, degrading practice, that many women died in childbirth as a result of it. Many had pain the rest of their lives, and yet they had to go through this ritual, if you would, because that was the only way they would be fully accepted in their society.
Mhm.
And so they decided that they would begin to see if there could be a change. They went to the First they went to the imam, who said there is nothing in our faith tradition that mandates this practice. It was a tribal practice. They went to the village chiefs, who were all men, who began to listen to them. And over time, they made the case, men and women coming together, and understood why, if they cared about the women in the village, they would no longer make it that they would have to go through this horror in their lives. In time, the norm changed from this deeply entrenched practice to the health of our women. They went through a process where a greater good was embraced by all. And it was the village chiefs, it was the men who said, "We intermarry. let's go to the other villages and tell them what we have done so they can follow. And yes, a law was passed in the country to outlaw this as a human rights violation. As important as laws are, there was no telling that the practice would end. But it was the coming together of the community to see the greater good. And so you can have these deeply entrenched practices or attitudes, mindsets that
Yeah.
pose such a problem where this can be resolved if it's fully addressed.
Yeah, this is a time when we're talking about reform. Ukraine President Zelensky talked about reform at the UN, and now you and I are talking about women's rights. And you just brought up Afghanistan in passing, but you had an extraordinary op-ed in the Washington Post titled "The World Must Demand the Taliban Stop Restricting Girls' Education." We all read that story, we watched the story, and our hearts were broken. In that article and in that op-ed, you and your co-author Roya Rahimi, who is also a fellow at Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and also a former Afghan ambassador to the U.S., you both argue that condemnation of the Taliban is not enough, notably by organizations like the United Nations. A red line must be established for the Taliban to reopen girls' schools. So why is this so important beyond literacy, beyond women's rights? Why is this something like this to open women's schools or women's rights and opening girls' schools is so detrimental for tolerance, mobility, conflict resolution, and ultimately a path away from extremism?
Well, and that's exactly right. It is important in and of itself. It is a right, but it has such implications for society, for what kind of society, understanding what education brings in terms of fulfilling the abilities and desires of people to make contributions through the economic lives of their countries, for example, to contribute to the leadership of their country, and those values that you just mentioned that are so critical to direction. And I think one of the things we tried to get across in that op ed was the fact that, you know, while the Taliban reference religion as the reason education shouldn't happen, so many of the neighboring countries, if you will, are stark examples of the opposite because education is prevalent and it is seen as the good that it represents. And you know, I often think about why do extremists first and foremost seem to attack uh, women and girls, but education. Is there something about an educated woman, an educated girl, that is so threatening? You know, why did Malala take a bullet? Because she wanted to go to school. And this is an area that authoritarians and extremists of one stripe or another try to um, e- erase, try to put obstacles in the path of progress, but it is so, so critical that they not succeed.
Yeah. And now we are witnessing the biggest displacement, perhaps, in our current history with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You are an American with Ukrainian roots. During the Clinton administration, you worked very hard during your time in the administration in bettering ties between Ukraine and the United States. You flew on Air Force One with Bill Clinton going to Ukraine, and so I'm very interested to see what you make of the conflict right now in terms of the displacement of women. What is it that we need to know most about it, and what are their immediate needs?
Well, it is true. It is, as a Ukrainian American, a deep part of my heritage. It was my grandparents who immigrated a long time ago to the United States. And it's often what we know and say about the United States, which is everybody came from someplace else. So I have had a very deep feeling for what happens in that country. And obviously, for some time now, actually, from the time when I was in the Clinton administration, just prior to it, Ukraine went the route of independence, embraced freedom, and has, in countless ways, from the years since, really worked to improve their society. Obviously, there are always issues that one has to contend with, but I think the fact that they have demonstrated that first with the so-called Orange Revolution, then with the Revolution of Dignity, the coming together of civil society, people across that nation for reform, for what freedom represents, not to be subjugated. And what you see now with this invasion, unprovoked invasion of a free and independent country, is this vast outpouring from all of that society in a united way. I was talking to a civil society leader the other day who said, you know, we have worked for years to engage and create a spirit of volunteerism in our country. And now it seems everybody is a volunteer.
Yeah.
And that ethos has made all of the difference for them, no less the women. Uh, Women have made considerable advancements over the years in Ukraine. And in more recent years, they adopted a framework that the UN established for women, peace, and security, women's engagement in uh, these these areas. When they first were invaded 8 years ago in the East, women volunteered to do what they could for their country in combat. And there were references to them as the invisible battalion, because in those years they weren't even allowed to have that role in the military. And since there's been dramatic change
Yeah.
in terms of the numbers of women in the armed forces, for example, women in the ministry, large numbers of women now both within the military and as volunteers doing all of they can. And then you see that what you referenced, that terrible exodus, the creation of tens of thousands of refugees who are protecting their children and having to cross borders to keep them safe while this is going on. So you've got women in Ukraine in in a full sum of actions to protect their families, protect their homeland, uh, doing everything conceivable to play the role that they can best play based on their circumstances to protect their homeland and to protect their families.
And these, when you are displaced as a woman with a child, it is so much harder than one can contemplate. And these immediate needs that we hear from different organizations perhaps really focus on, obviously, understandably, on shelter, on medicine, on blankets, on warm clothing during the winter. But there are also psychological aspects that need to be taken into consideration. There are also, women's groups play such an important role. As Martin Griffin yesterday said at the United Nations, women helping women during this time as refugees. Can you talk a little bit about that and the role of how women's groups on the ground can pave the way and help the refugees that are currently dealing with not only issues related to first aid and living issues, but also psychological issues and what to do next, basically.
Yeah, and that's a really good question because the reality is you've got the stark picture of just having to uproot and leave everything behind and go to a place where many of them don't know anyone and have to at least try to survive until this is resolved somehow. And it is those organizations on the ground, grassroots organizations. Their names may not be known even in a national way or certainly in an international way, but they play this vital role, community role of helping as they can. And besides the bare bones necessities of life that you so well described, these people are traumatized. They don't even know what the fulsome set of consequences are that are going to affect them and potentially their children. So being able to be protected and supported at this time, usually by people on the ground in the adjacent countries, from Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Moldova, etc. Those groups are coming together in significant ways to provide that support. But there's another area that is linked in all of this that really worries me greatly. And that is if you listen to the interviews from so many who are almost without any means to support themselves as they've had to make this trek, leaving their jobs behind, leaving their husbands and families behind in many instances, the adults,
Yeah.
uh, they are potentially subject to the kind of coercive tactics that the criminal traffickers use. And there's already considerable data that is reinforcing the fact, and this is always the case with traffickers, they work on the fringes of a conflict because they know that they're going to be able uh, to entice uh, people of great need to believing that the traffickers have the solution to their problems. So the other day I was listening to an interview in which two younger women, one I think one was a teenager and one may have just turned 20. She may still have been a teenager herself. They both said, well, we need to find a job. We need to find some support for ourselves. Now, you can just imagine a circumstance like that where a trafficker comes up to them and says, I've got a great opportunity for you. I've got a great job for you. We can help you out. Come with me. Well, that come with me makes their nightmare even worse. And I
Mm.
just fear that women in these vulnerable situations that they're now finding themselves unprotected without a whole lot of support are going to find themselves in the clutches of traffickers. And this region, obviously, trafficking is a problem the world over, but this is a region that has had more than its share of that of needing to deal with that problem. So it's one of many consequences that have to be addressed before they result in even worse situations affecting even more people.
Such an important point, and we learn more and more about it as time goes by. And perhaps something that you also focus on. You are currently the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, as we mentioned, Women, Peace, and Security. For the third year in a row, you have the latest index on women, peace, and security, which is really it's like an encyclopedia for us journalists. I went and looked through it. It has now been adopted and applied to measure the situation of forcibly displaced women. Since a lot of our audience are journalists and researchers, what are some of the findings that are important for us to know right now? Not only about from region to region, but again, those common threads when it comes to the challenges that forcibly displaced women face. And I assume something that you mentioned earlier, perhaps COVID has sort of pulled the curtain on a lot of these that we really didn't get a proper understanding of in the last 2 or some years.
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's an important perspective to be able to understand. First of all, the index is focused on the well being of women. It's probably the most comprehensive measure of women's well being. And how is that done? Using highly recognized data sets uh, in three dimensions. It measures inclusion, and that means, education levels, access to economic participation, political participation. What is the status of women in those areas? But then it adds two dimensions to get a more comprehensive understanding, and that is the dimension of justice. What are the discriminatory practices that impede a woman's well-being, as well as security? Is she secure in her home? Is she secure in her community? And looking at all of those together, we then rank countries in terms of how they're doing on the well-being of women. And obviously, it's important for the condition of women, but it's important also to understand how the well-being of and condition of women it correlates with the well-being and condition of nations. So nations and women's conditions and nations conditions really go hand in hand. And what you see in the rankings of the 170 plus countries is that countries that are more prosperous and peaceful have a much stronger index in terms of the well-being of women than those at the bottom. Those at the bottom are mired in conflict, instability, fragility, all of the kinds of conditions that one would want to avoid. So that's the essence of this index. And last year we looked at displacement of women as well, um, looking at the condition of the women, like those in Ukraine, for example,
Mhm.
about whom we've been talking, and what that bodes for them. And what one finds in a snapshot is that displaced women are far behind the women in the host countries in terms of their well being.
Yeah.
And also, displaced men are much ahead of displaced women in terms of what the condition is in which they find themselves, uh, both being in the category of displaced. And, you know, given the fact that the exodus from Ukraine is now the largest that our world has seen since the end of World War II, and the internally displaced within the country is also growing by the day, um, you can understand also in terms of what we just talked about specifics, whether it's what they need to survive, what they need in terms of a job, you can understand what it's doing to their well being.
Yeah. One of the things we love to do, and by we, I mean I personally, is talk to authors. I love the title of your book, Fast Forward How Women Can Achieve Power and Purpose. Talk about a timely book, a timeless book. Can you give us some advice from your book? Tell us what it's about. And again, what motivated you to go after writing a book like this?
Well, the genesis for the book, and I had a co author, we both came out of two different backgrounds. Mine was more government and civil society, hers, the law and the private sector. Uh, and our goal was to enable the reader to understand that, whatever our purpose is, it's important to be able to try to make progress on that purpose. But our goal was to accelerate progress for women and girls. If you look at the World Economic Forum, for example, they have set at the rate that they are looking at parity between men and women, the gaps that occur between men and women in a given country in several areas that they measure. It's going to take 100 years to close some of those gaps. Can we really afford another 100 years? And so our stimulus was to think about how can we accelerate? How can we do better than we're doing? And the bottom line was that in sharing a purpose like this, we need to look to the fact that we all have power. It shouldn't depend on that UN diplomat or on the head of that women's organization. We all have the capacity to really move forward in a purposeful way. And today, because of how connected we are uh, through technology and other ways, we can accelerate that progress even more. And so, what we do in the book is actually look at people who have really achieved in this way, men and women. A lot of it is focused on the private sector because we often don't look at the private sector as a key ally in this work.
Yeah.
CEOs that have embarked on huge programs and policies within their companies to make a difference. For example, one of the highlights was Coca-Cola creating 5 million new female entrepreneurs based on their value chain, something that they measure and ensure that they're meeting that goal. Other companies doubling the sourcing that they do from women entrepreneurs, buying from them to expand their markets or provide viable training, whether in agriculture or in other areas, uh, and or not necessarily the top of companies. We have the story of a young woman who was deeply engaged in a domestic violence program. That company was a leader in preventing domestic violence. A new CEO came in. He was told he was to cut the costs. And as he said to me later, he said, she didn't tell me the story, he did. He said, I would have cut that program if I didn't know anything about it. It seemed like it was superfluous. She went to him. She gathered up her strength. She was not a high level employee. And she went and explained to him the incredible difference that company was making in this space in the United States. That program was retained and continued to have impact because of that. Employees care about it. So it's basically those kinds of stories in a lot of areas, from technology to entrepreneurship to what we can happen in our everyday life to really accelerate progress, because we know that we have the power inside of us, and given our education, our placement where we find ourselves, to really carry out our purpose with one another in a very connected way.
Well, thank you so much for that, Ambassador Verveer. It was so nice speaking to you. We hope you come back, talk to us again. I know our members will be so happy and so excited to learn more about the work that you're doing, not only at Georgetown, but I know you'll be doing a lot more work as well personally. So do keep us posted, and please do come back. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for today's conversation, and for all you and your colleagues do.
Thank you.